Christmas Day, 1863, arrived wrapped in snow and silence, the kind of silence that feels too deliberate to be peaceful. The master believed himself clever. He believed that sins committed before sunrise could be hidden by church bells and carols, that God looked away on holy days, and that gold could quiet anything that tried to speak. When the wagons came, he did not watch for long. 12 children were taken, their chains muffled with cloth, so the neighbors would hear nothing but the wind. He told himself it was mercy. Selling them together, on a day meant for giving. He told himself many things. Christmas morning in 1863 did not begin with hymns or laughter in the master's house. It began before dawn, when the sky was still bruised with night, and the snow lay untouched, clean enough to pretend nothing wrong could ever stain it. The master rose early, not out of devotion, but out of calculation. He believed timing mattered. He believed that sins committed on holy ground, wrapped in ritual and silence, dissolved more easily into the cold air. By the time church bells would ring, the deed would already be done, buried beneath prayer and tradition. The 12 children were gathered quietly, their small breaths fogging the darkness. They had been chosen carefully, not for mercy, but for convenience. Young enough not to fight, old enough to walk. The master did not meet their eyes as they were lined up near the back gate, where the lantern light barely reached. He told himself this was business, not cruelty. He told himself families were broken every day, and that today was no different simply because it carried the name of Christmas. In his mind, the date itself became a shield, something sacred enough to dull the sharpness of what he was doing. Snow began to fall as the wagons arrived, soft flakes drifting down like absolution. The master watched from the porch, his coat pulled tight, his breath steady. He noted the sound of chains wrapped in cloth, the way the drivers spoke in low voices, the efficiency of it all. Efficiency comforted him. It made the act feel smaller, contained, manageable. He thought of the gold he would receive and the debts it would erase, and how tomorrow he would sit in church among other men who had done similar things and worse. All of them nodding solemnly as if holiness were something earned by posture alone. When the last child stepped onto the wagon, something tightened in the master's chest, not quite guilt, but close enough to irritate him. He dismissed it as the cold. He told himself that God understood necessity, that survival excused harshness, that the world had always been built this way. As the wagons rolled away into the snow-dark road, he whispered a short prayer, not for the children, but for himself, asking that the day pass quietly, asking that nothing follow him home, asking that Christmas, of all days, remain kind to him. The wagons moved slowly through the falling snow, their wheels carving dark lines into the white road, as if marking a path that could never be erased. The children sat close together, their thin coats pulled tight, breath rising in small, trembling clouds. No one cried. That was what unsettled the drivers most. There were no pleas, no sudden movements, no desperate calls for mothers who would never hear them. Silence followed the wagons like a shadow, heavy and deliberate, as though the children had agreed on it long before this morning arrived. As the house disappeared behind the curve of the road, each child turned their head at nearly the same moment. It was not a frantic gesture, not the wild look of fear the men expected. It was slow and precise, almost careful. 12 faces looked back through the curtain of snow, eyes reflecting lantern light like still water under ice. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stretch, and the road felt longer than it should have been. The drivers shifted uneasily, urging the horses forward, yet the sense of being watched did not fade. The children's expressions did not accuse, nor did they beg. There was something quieter in their gaze, something that felt heavier than anger. It was as if they were memorizing the shape of the house, the angle of the roof, the way smoke drifted from the chimney, fixing it in their minds so it could never be lost. One child lifted a hand, not to wave, but to rest it against the wooden side of the wagon, fingers spread, pressing as though touching the past itself. The wood creaked faintly beneath that small pressure. Snow thickened, muffling sound, until even the horses' hooves seemed distant. The road ahead blurred, but the feeling behind them sharpened. The drivers felt it in their spines, a cold that had nothing to do with winter. They did not look back again. They did not want to see those eyes twice. In the silence, a strange calm settled over the children, too deep to be mistaken for resignation. It felt deliberate, chosen, like a door closing softly rather than being slammed. As the wagons continued, the master's house remained visible longer than it should have, its dark outline lingering between bare trees, as if refusing to be left behind. The children's heads turned forward again, one by one, but the weight of their stare remained on the road, on the air, on the men who pulled the reins. The moment passed, yet it did not end. It followed the wagons through the snow, settled into the grooves of the wheels, and drifted backward on the wind, returning to the house long before the wagons were gone, as though something unseen had been released at the exact instant those 12 silent gazes fell upon the place they were never meant to leave when the final wagon vanished beyond the trees, and the road settled back into stillness. The master remained on the porch longer than necessary. The cold had crept through his boots, yet he did not move, listening to the quiet he expected to feel relieved by. Instead, something thin and uncertain slipped into the space the wagons left behind. It was then he heard it, faint at first, like a mistake the air was making. A soft chiming sound drifted toward him, light and irregular, as though small bells were being touched rather than rung. He turned his head slowly, scanning the yard, the road, the bare branches trembling under snow. There were no carolers, no passing sleighs, no church bells scheduled for hours yet. The sound did not come from any single direction. It seemed to hover, moving just out of reach of certainty. Each note arrived late, as if delayed by thought, and faded too quickly to be held. The master felt irritation before fear, convincing himself it was only the wind finding its way through iron or glass. But the wind did not repeat itself with such care. The chiming returned, clearer now, 12 delicate notes overlapping and then separating, never forming a proper melody. His chest tightened. He stepped off the porch and stood in the snow, listening harder, as though effort might force the sound to reveal its source. The bells seemed closer when he focused, farther when he moved, retreating whenever he tried to claim them as something ordinary. They sounded like the kind hung on doors, on wrists, on small things meant to be counted. A memory stirred against his will, something about Christmas services long ago, when bells were rung to announce birth and blessing. This sound carried none of that warmth. It felt hollow, stripped of celebration, like an echo left behind after joy had been removed. The master noticed his breath fogging faster, his pulse rising, though the yard remained empty. Snow fell thicker, yet the bells cut through it, untouched by the hush that covered everything else. When the sound finally ceased, it did not end cleanly. It thinned, stretched, and then stopped as though interrupted rather than finished. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing against his ears, until he realized he was holding his breath. Somewhere deep in the house, wood shifted, a subtle complaint traveling through the beams. The master turned toward the door, suddenly eager to be inside, to close something between himself and the open air. But as he reached for the handle, a final, single chime sounded directly behind him, close enough to feel, gentle enough to promise it had not been the last afternoon. The house had changed in ways no one could name aloud. The servants felt it first, not as fear, but as discomfort that crept beneath the skin and refused to settle. The fire burned steadily, yet the rooms never warmed. Breath lingered longer in the air, pale and thin, even near the hearth. When doors were opened, a chill followed through the halls, as though the cold outside had learned the layout of the house and moved through it with intention. Whispers began in corners where no one stood. A maid carrying linens paused when she heard her name spoken softly behind her, only to find the corridor empty. Another servant swore he felt small fingers brush his wrist, while passing the staircase, light as dust, gone before he could pull away. No one wanted to be alone. They gathered closer than usual, working in pairs, glancing over shoulders, speaking in half-finished sentences that died before becoming sound. The master noticed their unease and mistook it for idleness. He barked orders sharper than necessary, his voice echoing oddly, as if the walls delayed it before letting it go. Each command returned to him thinner, changed, stripped of authority. He sat in his study, papers spread before him, yet the ink looked darker than it should have, as though absorbing more light. The room smelled faintly of snow, despite the windows being shut tight. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. The servants paused, listening to the soft rhythm, moving above them, too light for an adult, too steady to be dismissed as settling wood. The sound traveled the length of the upper hall and stopped, leaving behind a silence that rang louder than noise. Candles flickered without draft, flames bending inward as if bowing to something unseen passing by. The cold deepened with the hours, pressing into the bones. Hands numbed quickly, metal objects biting sharply at the skin. One servant crossed himself in secret. Another muttered a prayer meant for the dying. They all felt it, the sense that the house was no longer empty, yet not filled in any way that could be counted. It was occupied without bodies, crowded without breath. When the master finally rose to ring for tea, the bell produced no sound. He struck it again, harder, and felt resistance, as though something else had already claimed its voice. His hand trembled, and for a moment he imagined frost creeping up his fingers, but when he looked, there was nothing there. Still, the room felt smaller, closer, as if the walls leaned inward to listen along with the servants, along with the floors, along with whatever had followed the children home, and learned how to live inside the cold days. Dusk settled, and the last light drained from the sky. Frost began to gather on the windows, thin and delicate at first, tracing pale veins along the glass. The servants noticed it while drawing the curtains, pausing when the patterns seemed wrong, too deliberate, too slow in their forming. The cold pressed harder now, breathing against the panes from both sides, and the frost thickened into cloudy shapes that blurred the view of the yard. Then, one by one, shapes appeared that did not belong to winter. Small handprints pressed into the frost, as if from the outside, each one perfectly formed, fingers splayed, palms flat. They were not smeared or sliding, but firm, intentional, as though someone had stopped and leaned in to look. The frost around them thinned briefly, revealing clear glass beneath, before creeping back and swallowing the shapes whole. A servant gasped and stepped away, crossing herself, her breath coming fast. When she looked again, the window was empty, smooth with cold, as if nothing had touched it at all. The phenomenon repeated throughout the house. In the parlor, near the tall windows that overlooked the road, 3 handprints bloomed at once, side by side, small enough to belong to children. In the hallway, a single print appeared low on the glass, at a height no adult would reach without bending. Each time, The prince lingered just long enough to be seen, long enough to be doubted, and then vanished, leaving behind a deeper chill that seeped into the room. Word spread quickly, carried in whispers that trembled as much as the air. No one wanted to say what they were thinking, yet the thought moved between them anyway, unspoken but shared. They avoided the windows, turning their backs to the outside, though the feeling of being watched did not fade. The master was summoned at last, irritation sharpening his steps as he followed a servant to the parlor. He scoffed when told, dismissing it as nerves, as tricks of cold and failing light. But when he reached the window, 12 handprints emerged all at once, pressing outward from the frost in perfect silence. The master froze, breath caught in his throat as the glass creaked softly under the pressure. For a brief moment, he thought he felt warmth beneath his palm when he touched the window, a faint pulse where one small hand seemed to meet his own. Then the frost reclaimed the glass, the prints dissolved, and the master pulled back sharply, his hand burning with cold, the room holding its breath, as if waiting for something more to appear, something that would not fade so easily. Payment arrived just after nightfall, delivered in a locked iron box carried by a man who would not meet the master's eyes. Snow clung to the man's coat, melting into dark patches on the floor as he set the box down and stepped back as if eager to be gone. The master dismissed him quickly, the door closing with a sound that echoed longer than it should have. Alone in his study, he knelt and opened the box, expecting the familiar comfort of weight and certainty. Inside lay stacks of coins, neatly arranged, their surfaces dull rather than shining. He lifted one and felt a sharp sting, as if the metal had been left in ice far longer than winter should allow. The cold seeped instantly into his skin, biting deeper than frost. He dropped the coin, annoyed, and laughed under his breath, telling himself it was nothing more than exposure to the night air. Yet when he tried again, gathering several coins into his palm, the chill spread upward, crawling along his fingers like something alive. As he counted, the coins made a sound unlike metal touching metal. It was softer, muted, closer to bone than silver. The room seemed to dim with each number spoken aloud, candlelight shrinking as though pressed back by an unseen presence. When he finished, he realized his hands were trembling. He set the coins aside and noticed dark smudges blooming across his palms, as if soot had been pressed into his skin. He rubbed them hard with a cloth, but the stains did not fade. Instead, they deepened, seeping into the lines of his hands as though absorbed. A strange heaviness settled in his chest. The gold that had once felt like triumph now sat in the box like a burden, dense and watchful. He tried to close the lid, but for a moment it resisted, catching on something unseen. When it finally shut, the sound was not the clean click of iron on iron, but a dull thud, final and heavy. The master wiped his hands again, breath uneven, and glanced toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there. The stains on his palms began to ache, a slow, pulsing discomfort that matched his heartbeat. He flexed his fingers and imagined the marks spreading, imagined them climbing his wrists, branding him in a language only the body understood. The room felt colder, though the fire still burned. Shadows gathered in the corners, thicker than before, and the master had the sudden, unwelcome thought that the payment was not merely cold, but remembered, that it had passed through other hands before his own and had not forgotten the cost of being counted. When the church bells began to ring for the Christmas night service, the master felt a brief flicker of relief. The sound was familiar, orderly, a reminder of rules and rhythms older than fear. He stood by the window and listened, expecting the bells to roll across the snow in clean waves, each chime following the last with comforting precision. Instead, the first note arrived late, as though the bell had hesitated before speaking. The second followed too slowly, dragging behind the first like a shadow that could not keep up. The rhythm faltered, stretching and compressing in ways that unsettled the ear. Each chime sounded slightly wrong, as if the metal were cracked or the rope pulled by uncertain hands. The master frowned, counting under his breath, trying to impose order on the sound. He failed. The bells refused to settle into anything recognizable. Some notes rang too long, vibrating until they thinned into a faint whine. Others cut off abruptly, swallowed by the air before they could finish speaking. As the distorted ringing continued, the house seemed to react. Windows trembled gently, not from force, but from something like recognition. The floorboards hummed beneath his boots, carrying the sound through the structure, as if the house itself were listening. With each uneven chime, the master felt a tightening in his chest, a growing certainty that these bells were not calling him toward grace, but measuring something unseen, marking time in a way that had nothing to do with prayer. He stepped outside, snow crunching beneath his feet, hoping distance would restore the sound to normal. It did not. The bells grew louder, yet no clearer, as though the night were amplifying their wrongness. The echoes returned from unexpected directions, bouncing off trees and empty fields in delayed fragments. One chime would reach him. Then another would follow seconds later from the opposite side. Out of order, out of place. It sounded less like a call to worship, and more like a warning struggling to be understood. The master pressed his gloved hands to his ears, but the sound slipped through, vibrating in his skull. With each distorted note, images flickered in his mind, small hands on cold glass, silent faces turning back on a snowy road, coins darkening his palms. He whispered a prayer, words tumbling over each other, but the bells answered with a harsh, dragging chime that drowned him out. When the ringing finally ceased, it did not fade gently. It stopped mid-note, cut cleanly as if severed. The sudden silence felt violent, leaving his ears ringing with a phantom echo that refused to die. The master stood alone in the snow, breath shaking, aware that whatever had twisted the bells had done so deliberately, bending something sacred into something else, something that would not be undone simply by stepping back inside and closing the door when the master returned to the dining room that evening. He expected emptiness and order, the familiar reassurance of a space arranged to his command. Instead, he stopped short in the doorway, his breath catching as his eyes moved slowly across the long table. 12 place settings had been laid with careful precision. Plates gleamed faintly in the candlelight, cutlery aligned just so, napkins folded with a care that bordered on reverence. He had given no such instruction. The servants stood frozen behind him, their faces pale, each silently counting what their eyes already knew. The master stepped forward, anger rising to cover the unease creeping up his spine. He demanded to know who had done this, his voice sharper than he intended, echoing strangely off the walls. No one answered. The servants shook their heads, some whispering oaths that they had not touched the table since morning. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against the chest, carrying with it a faint scent of cold and old wood, as if the night itself had been invited in. He moved along the table, examining each setting. The plates were empty, yet they felt occupied, as though something unseen waited just beyond sight. At each chair, the space seemed slightly disturbed, the air faintly warmer, as if someone had only just stood up. One chair at the far end was pulled back an inch, the floor beneath it marked with a thin line in the dust, small and shallow, like the scrape of something lighter than an adult's weight. The candles flickered as he passed, flames bending toward the chairs rather than the air currents. Shadows gathered behind each place, stretching long and thin across the floor, overlapping in ways that made counting difficult. The master's heart hammered as he reached the head of the table and realized there was no setting for him. The space before his chair was bare, polished wood reflecting the candlelight back at him without warmth. A low sound filled the room then, barely audible, like the murmur of many small breaths taken at once. The servants backed away, crossing themselves, eyes fixed on the chairs. The master clenched his fists, the dark stains on his palms aching as if in response. He told himself it was a prank, a cruel joke fueled by superstition, yet the thought rang hollow even as it formed. As he stood there, the candles flared briefly, and for a heartbeat he saw impressions on the chairs, slight dips in the cushions, as though 12 small bodies had settled into place. The impressions faded, but the sense of presence did not. The table waited in silence, perfectly set, patient and unmoving, as if expecting the master to take his place among the unseen guests and acknowledge what had been done in his house. On Christmas Day's night deepened, and the candles burned lower. The master began to notice the shadows behaving strangely. At first it was subtle, easy to dismiss as tired eyes or flickering flame. A shadow would stretch a little farther than it should, brushing the edge of a doorway, then retreat when he looked directly at it. Another would linger behind a chair long after the candle beside it had steadied. The master told himself shadows were nothing more than absence, that they could not move on their own, yet the certainty felt thin. Walking through the corridor, he slowed his steps, becoming aware of a quiet unease following him. His shadow fell ahead of him on the wall, long and narrow. But another shape moved beside it, slightly out of rhythm. He stopped. The extra shadow did not. It slid forward, elongated fingers reaching across the plaster, before melting into the darkness near the ceiling. His breath caught, heart pounding, as he raised the candle higher. The light revealed nothing unusual, yet the feeling of being accompanied did not fade. In the corners of the house, shadows thickened, pooling like ink spilled too slowly to notice. They gathered beneath the staircase, along the edges of door frames, behind curtains that stirred without wind. When the master passed, they seemed to lean inward, stretching toward him against the direction of the light. The candle flames bent away, as though reluctant to illuminate what waited just beyond their reach. The air grew colder with each step, and the house creaked softly, not in protest, but in acknowledgement. He turned suddenly, convinced something followed close behind. For a moment, his own shadow appeared fractured, split into smaller shapes that clung to his feet. He stamped the floor, anger flaring, and the fragments scattered, sliding back into corners where they merged with deeper darkness. His pulse roared in his ears. He could no longer tell where the light ended and where the shadows began, as though the boundary between them had thinned. From the far end of the hall, shadows began to move independently, gliding along the walls with a slow, deliberate patience. They did not rush. They drifted, gathering length and shape, forming outlines that hinted at smaller figures. He watched in horror as one shadow lifted an arm where no body stood, the gesture faint but unmistakable. Another shadow seemed to tilt its head, as if studying him. The master backed away, candle trembling in his grip. Each step he took forward caused the shadows to advance toward him instead, flowing uphill against the light. The house felt narrower now, corridors closing in, darkness pressing from all sides. He realized then that the shadows were no longer empty spaces, but presences shaped by memory and wrong, stretching toward him with quiet intent, filling the halls with a moving darkness that did not belong to the night alone. As the night pressed on, a sound began to weave through the house, that the master could not ignore. It was faint at first, almost a trick of the ears, a whisper carried on the draught that slipped through cracks in the walls. Then it became clear, unmistakable. Children singing. The melody was broken, disjointed, like a hymn half remembered and twisted. Each note trembled with uncertainty, rising and falling in uneven waves, echoing through the corridors as if the house itself had taken up the chant. The master froze, the candle in his hand, quivering in his grip, his eyes searching the empty rooms for any sign of life. There was none. The sound moved with him. When he stepped into the parlor, the voices drifted from the hallways behind, then seemed to circle back from the stairs above. Each time he tried to locate the source, the singing shifted, as if aware of his attention and deliberately evading it. The words themselves were nonsense, yet haunting in their clarity, forming a language that his mind could not place, but understood instinctively to be a warning. It was not cheerful, not festive. It carried the weight of absence, of things lost, and it drew him deeper into the house, despite his better judgment. Servants whispered from corners, afraid to move, afraid to listen too closely. Their eyes darted toward the ceiling, toward the walls, toward every shadow that the candlelight could barely touch. The master, stubborn, tried to tell himself it was only the wind, that the old timbers moaning under snow could mimic such sounds. But the cadence, the rhythm of the tiny voices, betrayed him. It was deliberate, synchronized in a way that no mere breeze could achieve. There was intent in it, a patient, deliberate shaping of sound meant for him alone. As he moved through the dining room, the music intensified. Each note seemed to pull the air toward the windows, pushing frost against the glass as if the sound itself had substance. The master's heart thumped in his chest, and he could feel his palms, already cold and stained from the coins, beginning to sweat despite the chill. The broken hymn wound through the rafters, curling around beams and dangling chandeliers, filling the empty corners where nothing should have lived. The song whispered of the children who were gone, of small hands pressed against frosted panes, of tiny breaths carried away into the snow. He knew instinctively that it was not meant to be heard by anyone else, that the house had become a vessel for something that could no longer stay outside. When he tried to speak, the sound caught in his throat. Each syllable he attempted to form was swallowed by the singing, leaving only the cold vibration of ghostly voices, close enough to brush his ears with breath that was not his own, small and sharp and certain. The master understood then that the melody was not a song but a summons, and that it was patient enough to wait until he could do nothing to escape it. Be the time the master dared to look at the portraits lining the walls. A creeping sense of dread had already taken hold. At first, he thought it was a trick of the flickering candlelight, the way shadows bent and shifted along the frames. But as he studied the painted faces of his ancestors, the unease grew into something far heavier. Their eyes, once painted with solemn dignity, now seemed to follow him with a quiet, impossible grief. He stopped moving, unwilling to take another step, feeling the gaze press into the back of his neck, like the weight of snow on a thin roof. The master's mind sought reason. Perhaps the paint had cracked, perhaps the oil had darkened unevenly. Yet the expressions had changed too clearly, too deliberately, for that to be the explanation. The eyes that had once been empty and still now shimmered with moisture, tiny rivulets that caught the candlelight in a way no varnish should. Tears, the color of sorrow itself, seemed to form slowly, pooling at the corners of each mouth and streaming down the cheeks in lines that left the rest of the faces untouched. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible if one blinked, but it was enough to stop his breath. He noticed them everywhere he turned. the ancestral patriarchs, the long-dead matriarchs. Each image held a quiet accusation, a knowledge that he had thought himself alone in committing acts of cruelty, acts he had disguised as necessity. Their painted eyes carried a history of judgment, unbroken by time or human forgetfulness. With every step he took, he felt their attention shift, always tracking, always aware. A chair moved slightly beneath him without explanation, candlelight flaring against the gilt frames, casting shadows that stretched toward him, as if they wanted to join in the silent admonishment. The room felt smaller, pressing in. Each portrait seemed alive in its stillness, a living testament to watchfulness, a reminder of lineage and consequence. He imagined the figures stepping from the frames, silent and deliberate, leaving the painted walls behind to stand in the room with him. He tried to turn away, tried to ignore the staring eyes, but the feeling clung to him. Even when he closed his own, he saw the faces in the darkness behind his lids, their tearful gaze imprinting itself on memory like frost on glass. A sudden draft made the candle flare and sputter. The master's palms itched, the dark stains from earlier growing warmer and more insistent. He felt a pull toward the portraits, a compulsion to acknowledge them, to kneel and confess. Yet fear rooted him to the spot. He realized with a rising panic that the house was no longer merely a building of wood and stone. It was alive with attention, memory, and accusation. And the painted eyes were only the first of many witnesses, waiting for the night to unfold further, for the consequences of his deeds to arrive with the patience of something that cannot be denied at the stroke of midnight. The world outside the master's house seemed to hold its breath. The snow, which had been falling steadily all evening, stopped as abruptly as if a hand had frozen it in place. Each flake hung suspended in the dark, motionless, turning the night into a frozen tableau of stillness. The master noticed first in the parlor, where the faint draft of the candle seemed unusually absent, the air unusually dense. The cold pressed against him from every side, sharper than any winter wind, and it carried a weight that was not natural, not part of the season, but deliberate and knowing. He stepped to the window and pressed his hand against the glass, expecting to feel the usual bite of frost. Instead, the pane felt impossibly smooth, almost liquid, yet beneath the surface, he sensed a subtle vibration, like the heartbeat of the house itself. Outside, the world was silent except for the soft crunch of snow beneath his own boots, and yet the snow held attention, a patient waiting. No animal stirred. No tree branches creaked, and even the distant hum of the village seemed swallowed by the night. It was not emptiness that filled the air, but attention, like the earth itself had paused to watch. The master's breath came faster, fogging the glass in small clouds that drifted upward only to remain oddly suspended. Something about the stillness unnerved him. It was too complete, too precise. He tried to convince himself it was simply the depth of winter, the hush that comes at midnight, but the sensation in his chest refused to allow belief. Each heartbeat echoed loudly in his ears, a sharp contrast to the absence of sound outside. Then came the faintest of movements, almost imperceptible at first. The snow on the roof shifted slightly, not falling but rearranging, as if something beneath it pressed against the surface. Shadows along the yard stretched unnaturally, bending toward the house despite the lack of moonlight. The master felt a prickling along the back of his neck, a warning he could not ignore. The stillness was not passive. It was patient, deliberate, observing, and it carried with it a presence he could neither see nor name. For the first time that night, he understood that the world he had known, the orderly patterns of night and frost, were no longer reliable. The natural laws that governed sound, light, and time had faltered at the edges. The air was thick with expectation, waiting for something to unfold, something that had been summoned by the acts committed earlier that day. The snow held its shape. The wind had vanished. The night waited with a patience older than him, as though the very earth had learned the names of the 12 children and intended to answer for what had been done to them. The sound of footsteps began softly, barely audible over the master's own heartbeat. At first, he thought it was the servants moving in their rooms, or perhaps the house settling under the weight of snow and night. But the rhythm was too precise, too deliberate, too small. 12 distinct sets of steps echoed from above, pacing the upper hall in perfect, unyielding rhythm. They were tiny, careful, deliberate, each step landing in a cadence that made his skin crawl, each tap resonating through the wooden floors, as if the very house were amplifying them. The master froze, candle trembling in his hand, listening. The steps did not falter. They moved forward, back forward again, a slow, methodical patrol of a corridor that should have been empty. Every instinct screamed that no child could have survived the morning, that the wagons had carried them far, yet the sound contradicted reason. Each footfall struck with certainty, leaving no space for mistake. The repetition built tension in the air, a pressure that seemed to push against his chest, as though the very rhythm was counting him down. He called out, his voice cracking, but the steps never paused. The echoes moved along the length of the hall, perfectly synchronized, as if the children themselves were invisible yet fully present. The sound was impossible in its precision, yet undeniably real, filling the space with a living accusation. The master took a hesitant step toward the staircase, and the steps above quickened slightly, almost in response, as if acknowledging him. He recoiled instinctively, recognizing too late that he was intruding into something that had been waiting for his attention. The candlelight flickered violently, shadows stretching unnaturally, lengthening to meet the rhythm above. He could feel vibrations traveling through the floorboards, small but insistent, like the pulse of tiny bodies moving in unison. The master's ears rang with the repetition, each step leaving an echo in the walls that refused to dissipate. He realized the sound was not merely footsteps. It was a presence, 12 presences, moving with deliberate intent, tracking him through the house. His hands, already cold and stained from earlier transactions, clenched the candle as the rhythm shifted. The steps drew nearer, though he could not see them, pacing closer to the edge of the staircase, pressing toward him without breaking cadence. It was not just a sound, it was a message, an unmistakable statement, that the house was no longer his, that it belonged to those he had sent away, and that every step marked the approach of reckoning. Each footfall pressed into his bones, shaking the house with patient insistence, and the master understood, with a shiver of terror, that these 12 small presences had returned, and they would not rest until he answered for what had been done. Panic finally took hold of the master, sharp and insistent, urging him to flee to his bedroom and lock the door. He moved quickly, stumbling over the rug, candle flickering wildly, shadows dancing across the walls. Behind him, the faint echo of small footsteps continued, keeping pace with his hurried steps, though he tried to convince himself it was only his imagination. When he reached the bedroom, he slammed the door shut and turned the key, the metal biting cold against his palm, a barrier that felt both protective and fragile. For a moment, he thought he was safe. The room seemed ordinary, familiar, walls lined with furniture that had always been there, and yet the atmosphere was thicker, heavier, as though the very air had weight. The candlelight flickered and bent toward the corners of the room, and he felt the pull of something unseen drawing the darkness inward, gathering it quietly, patiently. His breathing was rapid, shallow, each exhale trembling as he tried to convince himself that he was alone, that the steps, the frost, the shadows, and the singing were all figments of a mind pushed past reason. Then he noticed them. Small fingerprints appearing on the inside of the door. They were delicate, perfectly formed, and in that moment the master realized that locking the door had not stopped them. The prints began to form slowly, one by one, descending from the top of the door to the handle. Each mark pressed firmly into the wood, leaving no smudge, no sliding trace, just the clear impression of tiny hands that should not exist in that space. His chest tightened as he stared at them, coldness creeping up his spine, crawling across his shoulders like ice, water. He pounded the floor with his fists, cursed, and pressed his ear to the door, expecting to hear nothing, and yet the faintest sound of breathing accompanied each new fingerprint, measured and deliberate. There was patience in the rhythm, certainty in the pressure, as though whoever, or whatever, was making them knew exactly what fear meant and intended to stretch it, shape it, press it into the night like snow underfoot. The master tried to retreat, but the space seemed smaller, corners of the room bending toward him, the shadows lengthening, curling around the bedposts and walls. Every instinct screamed that the presence outside the door was no longer bound by ordinary laws. The fingerprints multiplied, 12 small marks in total, each corresponding to a child who should have been gone. They climbed downward slowly, inexorably, until the last reached the handle, and the master understood, with a cold, suffocating certainty, that the barrier between him and the unseen 12 was meaningless. The hands had found a way in, pressing insistently, reminding him that nothing in the house, not wood, nor metal, nor candlelight, could protect him from the reckoning that had come for what he had done that morning. The candles, once trembling but alive with light, flared suddenly and died, plunging the room into a darkness so complete it seemed to press against the master's skin. The fire in the hearth sputtered and shrank, embers glowing weakly before fading entirely, leaving the study empty of warmth and light. The master's breath caught in his throat as he fumbled blindly, hands outstretched, searching for something, anything, to hold on to that could anchor him in reality. The air was thick, suffocating, carrying the faint metallic tang of cold and fear, and every instinct told him he was no longer alone. The absence of light transformed the familiar room into something alien. Shadows no longer depended on candlelight. They moved independently, stretching, twisting, merging into shapes too dark to define. He could feel the pressure of the darkness, not just around him but within him, as though it had weight and intention. Every step he took seemed to echo, yet the sound was swallowed almost immediately, leaving only the oppressive silence, broken intermittently by the softest scrape of a toe across the floor, or the faintest shift of air that suggested presence. He tried to relight the candles, striking flint again and again, but the flames would not catch. Sparks hissed and died, as though the very possibility of light had been denied. The master's panic escalated, muscles tightening, heartbeat hammering, each thump seeming unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. The room seemed to pulse with its own life, expanding and contracting in rhythm with his rising fear. A cold wind swirled through the closed windows, brushing against the master's neck and whispering along the walls, yet no door or shutter was open to admit it. Something moved across the floor, too small and quick for him to catch, but tangible enough that he stumbled backward. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken form, sliding along the walls, stretching and curling, invading the room with a deliberate slowness that was worse than speed. Every instinct screamed for flight, yet the darkness confined him, pressing in from all sides, making the familiar furniture seem like obstacles in a maze that had no exit. The master could feel their presence now. 12 distinct, deliberate presences, each moving with patient certainty. He heard the faintest sound of breathing, light, careful, and multiplied, surrounding him in every direction. The room was no longer a safe space. It had become a vessel for something that existed outside the natural laws of man or house. Cold seeped into his bones, deeper than any winter wind. And he understood with absolute clarity that the extinguished flames were only the beginning, that the darkness had become alive and patient, waiting for him to realize that light could no longer protect him from what had come to claim the house, the night, and the reckoning of Christmas Day. Whispers began faintly at first, brushing along the edges of the master's ears like the rustle of silk, almost imperceptible in the heavy darkness that had swallowed the room. He froze, heart hammering, trying to convince himself it was only imagination, the echoes of his own fear. But the sound persisted, low and deliberate, carrying a rhythm that was not human, a cadence that pressed insistently into his mind. Names were spoken, soft, precise, almost reverent, but each name was accompanied by a weight that seemed to press against his chest. First, the names of the children, each one drawn out, whispered as though measured in ice, small and deliberate syllables that made him flinch as though struck. The master's body tensed as the voices circled him. They did not come from a single joint, nor a discernible direction. They moved around him, through the air, brushing his ears and neck with intangible fingers. The rhythm was relentless. 12 voices each aligned with the children, who had been taken from the house that morning, echoing through the walls, multiplying as though the house itself had joined in the chorus. He realized with a jolt that the voices were patient. They would not stop until they had been fully acknowledged. The cold that had been creeping along his spine now surged through his body, biting at his lungs, threading through his bones, making him shiver violently despite the heat of the earlier fire. Then, almost impossibly, the final name broke through. A whisper of his own, spoken softly, almost tenderly, but with a clarity that froze his blood. It was not simply a sound. It carried intent, accusation, and inevitability all at once. The room seemed to vibrate with the utterance, the walls pressing closer, the darkness pooling around him, as if the very house were responding to the call. The master's legs wobbled beneath him as he pressed backward, instinctively seeking an escape that did not exist. But the voices followed, circling with precise cadence, each repetition measured, deliberate, inescapable. He clutched at the door, trying to close himself off from the sound, but the whispers penetrated, wrapping around his mind. Each syllable was a reminder of the children he had sold, of the cold transaction that he had justified in his own mind, of the gold that had burned in his palms. The names echoed endlessly, layering over each other, 12 small presences and one guilty one, repeating, pressing, accusing. The master's breathing grew ragged, his body trembling, but the voices did not pause. They did not falter. They were patient. They would wait for him to understand fully that the reckoning had come, that the whispers were not merely sound, but embodiment, and that their final note, the one that carried his name, meant that nothing, not fire, nor walls, nor the locks on doors, could protect him from the judgment that had arrived with the 12 children who were gone, but not absent. The master's last thread of certainty unraveled as a sudden. Chilling laughter filled the house, high and small, yet multiplied into a dozen voices, overlapping and echoing in the corners of every room. It was not playful, nor innocent. It carried a weight of knowledge, a precision that made the hair on his neck stand rigid. The sound moved as if it had its own body circling him, darting from one shadowed corner to the next, coming from above, below, behind, and yet never fully visible. The master's pulse thundered in his ears, and the candle in his hand flickered violently, casting shadows that writhed and twisted in response to the laughter, stretching toward him like reaching fingers. He stumbled backward into the parlor, furniture appearing suddenly as obstacles in his path, shadows deepening into shapes that seemed almost corporeal. Each laugh, a crisp and deliberate note, struck with unnerving precision, forming a pattern he could not escape. The echoes multiplied, growing louder, closer, and somehow patient, as though measured to prolong his terror, to make each heartbeat a hammer striking in rhythm with the unseen presence. He realized then that the voices were not merely in the air. They resonated through the walls, through the floorboards, vibrating the very structure of the house. It was as though the house itself had become an instrument, amplifying the children's presence, shaping the sound to fill every inch of the master's perception. Desperation clawed at him. He swung the candle, casting light into the corners, expecting, hoping, to reveal the source. Yet there was nothing. Only shadows, stretching and merging with one another, creating forms that suggested movement without bodies. He could feel the gaze of 12 invisible eyes upon him, tracking, judging, patient and precise. The laughter shifted, moving with him, sometimes behind, sometimes above, sometimes surrounding him entirely. Each note seemed to carry a small accusation, a reminder of the children, of the acts he had committed, and of the night itself that had been altered by his deeds. His legs gave way beneath him as he fell to the floor, the candle extinguished in a sudden puff of cold air. Darkness swallowed him, yet the laughter did not cease. It became sharper, more insistent, circling him in the void. He could hear tiny footsteps accompanying it, careful and deliberate, pacing the boundaries of the room, moving closer with every echo. The master's breath caught, chest tight, and he realized, with unshakable certainty, that the 12 were no longer absent. They had returned, not as children, not as shadows, but as forces in the house itself, patient, deliberate, and unstoppable, orchestrating a reckoning that he could not flee, touch, or ignore. Their laughter the final proof that his deeds had summoned something beyond his comprehension, something that had come to claim what was owed. That night the master felt it before he saw it, a sudden shift in the air that carried the weight of inevitability. The house seemed to breathe as one, walls expanding and contracting subtly, floorboards vibrating beneath him with the pulse of something alive. He stumbled, trying to retreat to the study, but the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, bending in ways that defied logic, twisting the familiar into unfamiliar. Each step brought him deeper into a labyrinth that had been constructed not of wood or stone, but of presence and intention. The cold pressed from every direction, sharper, heavier, carrying the quiet insistence of 12 small presences he could not see, yet could feel in every nerve, every inch of his skin. The whispers returned, louder now, threading through the silence like thin threads of ice. They spoke his name softly, deliberately, and each repetition carried more weight than the last, echoing with the memory of the children, their stolen innocence, and the gold that had changed hands too easily. He tried to cover his ears, to shut the sound out, but it was inside him now, pressing against his skull, vibrating through his chest. The darkness had become physical, tangible, wrapping around his limbs, slowing his movements, bending the space in which he existed until the rooms themselves seemed to lean in, watching, waiting. Then he saw them. At first, only glimpses, small shapes at the edges of vision, flickering, impossible to hold in focus. They moved with careful precision, circling, forming lines, retreating only to return. 12 small forms, indistinct yet undeniable, each carrying the weight of the day's injustice. Their faces were pale and shadowed, their eyes impossibly bright in the darkness, fixed on him with the patience of something older than fear. They did not speak, but the accusation was clear, a silent verdict pressing on him as heavily as the snow-laden air outside. The master's knees gave way, and he fell to the floor, hands clawing at the cold boards. But the presence followed, filling the space, climbing over every surface, pressing against his chest, his back, his very spirit. The whispers rose into a chorus, 12 voices joined with one, repeating his name, chanting in a rhythm that matched the pulse in his skull. Each syllable was deliberate, a mark of reckoning that could not be ignored, slowed, or deflected. He understood then that there would be no reprieve, no light to illuminate safety, no door to close between him and what had come for him. The room itself seemed to dissolve, boundaries melting, as the 12 moved closer. Small figures impossibly filling the space, their presence overwhelming every sense. Cold, sound, air, and shadow became one force, pressing inward, suffocating, asserting their dominance over the house and over him. The master realized, with a terror that froze his very being, that the night had claimed him, that every act of cruelty had been observed and measured, and that the 12 children, though gone from the world of the living, had returned with patience, precision, and purpose to demand the reckoning. He could no longer escape,